what was the context of the colonies going into 1775? Obviously, you have the Boston Massacre, you have the Boston Tea Party, Britain's imposing these taxes. There's a lot of unrest going on. So, what sets the stage for this conflict?
Well, to a lot is the previous war, and that ended in 1763, what we call the French and Indian War, that the British call the 7 Years' War, and the context was that the war had cost the British Parliament a lot of money, and they were trying to find sources of revenue. The colonies weren't colonists weren't paying taxes, or as much as certainly as much as the colonists, the Parliament thought they should. So they started coming up with ideas on taxes. But of course, everyone always objects to taxes. That is a common refrain throughout American history. We all object. But the big issue they had, the true issue they had, was that there was no representation. They were not asked to how the money was going to be spent. They weren't asked how much was going to be taken. There was no representation in Parliament from the colonists. There was an argument among the British that we gained representation through the royal patronage system, and that somehow that flowed out to us in the colonies. But in fact, of course, it didn't. There was no Americans in Parliament. There's no Americans in the aristocracy. There's very few aristocrats ever came to America. So there was a big, the Atlantic Ocean was a giant several week break between back and forth. So this is what our objection was, and in fact, that's a British objection. The whole point of the Magna Carta was taxation with representation. It's part of their constitution as well, or what they consider their constitution. And they were denying it to us, and Parliament got caught up thinking about what its rights were vis-a-vis the colonists, and not what were their duties and obligations to the subjects of King George.
For sure. You brought up an interesting point, and it was in the book, and I'd never really thought of this aspect of sort of the causes of the American Revolution. And one of the characters in the book, I believe it was Jason Green, he says, if there's a war, the seeds were planted in the last one, meaning the French and Indian War. What exactly does that mean? Why is that?
Um, well, in the context of the book, in the context of the characters in the book, a lot of them were brought into the war, the last war. Well, we actually, to be perfectly honest, the war started 2 years earlier here than it did in Europe, because of fights between the French and English colonists. But their promises were made by the British government like property, land grants, etc., that were not kept. The British wanted us to serve, we the Americans to serve as soldiers in a British officered army, and the colonists resented the lordly. You read this over and over again. Our lordly British masters. And there was a lot of resentment that the British we had a lot of resentment for the British, and that they didn't really understand. I think they never grasped how much we resented being treated as second class citizens. And it's kind of actually the theme of the book is everybody feels that they are a first class citizen in their own country, or should be a first class citizen in their country, and we weren't. And neither were African Americans first class citizens in our own country.
Right. That's obviously the big hypocrisy of the founding generation. But it is interesting, the colonists and the British were fighting alongside each other, but there still was this separation, sort of, I guess, on class, that the British had sort of a condescending view of the colonists, and it sort of fostered a lot of bitterness and resentment that carried over into this conflict. So,
Use an example of George Washington. George Washington was a major in the British Army. In fact, they're not too far from here, and near Erie, Pennsylvania. There is a statue of George Washington in a British uniform. It's the only statue of George Washington in a British uniform anywhere, because he fought on the Braddock's campaign. And one of the things that he resented was that the British were considered superior. Even if you were the same rank and experience as a British officer, you were a colonist was considered a colonial officer was inferior to the British officers. And that also built up resentment that especially George Washington was a very proud man.
Hmm. Yeah, he definitely was. So there's all this unrest going on. There's taxation without representation. There's sort of unrest in the colonies because of this. What exactly is the British response? What's King George's sentiment and Parliament's sentiment, and how are they approaching this unrest? Because obviously, you know, no one wants what they at the time and what it really was a civil war. They wanted to prevent a civil war because they saw the colonists as Englishmen still. These are still our brothers. So they want to prevent war and conflict, but there's all this unrest. So what's exactly is their approach to quell that?
Right. Well, there was divisions in Parliament too about how it should be handled, and they didn't really have political parties like we have them, but they had sentiment that they divided up called Whigs and Tories, which I mentioned there. And the Whigs were they weren't pro-American, but they were much more sympathetic to what the Americans were talking about. While King George, a lot of, and oddly enough, a lot of the colonists thought that King George just didn't understand what was going on. That if he'd really known what was going on, he would have stopped it. But I think King George pretty much did know what was going on. In fact, was directing some of it. But the Parliament's response was to talk about what they were trying to do and what they thought were their rights. They had the right to impose taxes on the subjects of the British Empire, and we were resenting that, and so they would came up then. But then the parliamentary disagreements would come up, and they would take the tax. One side would finally prevail over the other, and they'd take the tax away. Then a new one would come. But the tea tax is the last thing. And the tea tax was a lot more complex because that was in part to preserve the monopoly of the East India Company, which had a monopoly on importing tea, and that was the biggest problem that we had is that this or that the British had was they were trying to protect the East India Company as opposed to trying to protect the rights of the colonists.
You make such an interesting point, and I think it's one that a lot of people don't realize is even in the British Parliament there was a lot of division. I know William Pitt, one of the prominent aristocrats, I guess, in Parliament, he says it is my opinion that this kingdom has no right to lay a tax upon the colonies. So even in Parliament, people were realizing, hey, this probably isn't really that cool taxing these guys without their representation in Parliament.
Right, and I hint at even the British soldiers in the North American colonies. There was divisions even among them. There's some of the officers refused to participate and returned to England. There was a big problem. Not a big problem. I mean, it was most of it, but the king was actually informed sometimes when some of these guys went home and they're ruined their careers, but they did not want to. They totally disagree with what was going on. Even some of the prominent generals, like General Howe, he was a Whig and he wanted to find some political solution, but was they were Parliament never gave him enough power to negotiate a solution.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I want to commend you on when it comes to this book. We talked a little bit about it off camera, and you wrote this book as a historical fiction, not necessarily a nonfiction historical analysis. It's a fiction of, in the conflict, you're experiencing it firsthand from all sorts of different perspectives. And one of the interesting things I noticed was even among the British regulars who were in the colonies, a lot of them um, they didn't like their officers. There was desertion. There wasn't exactly the sentiment um, that they wanted to be there.
Right, right. Well, the British Army at that time, again, partially due to that Parliament didn't have the resources to fund a global army, and but the British soldiers were grossly underpaid. The individual private soldier was grossly underpaid. And the officers' system was that they had to buy their commissions, and so what they did is they couldn't afford to buy the commission. So what they would say you wanted to be a lieutenant colonel, command a regiment, you would have to sell your majority, as they call it, your major rank, and use that in part to buy lieutenant colonel. Well, lieutenant colonel is more expensive, so you have to find some either borrow money to to buy the rank, and then you would have, since your pay is not anywhere near enough to compensate you for what this new debt you've obligated to, you have to find up ways of coming up with money. One of the ways they came up with money was they made the soldiers buy their uniforms, and then the officers pocketed the profit and used that to help repay some of the other debts and also pay their family. But the entire burden of the system fell on the private soldier, who had to buy his weapon and his uniform and everything else. So it was a huge problem. And then punishment was awful. And they had all kinds of the flogging we've heard about. And again, they referred to the soldiers sometimes as bloody backs, so people think it's because of the red uniforms, but it's because they were being flogged all the time. It was a harsh system, and the British soldiers struggled throughout the war, throughout most of the 18th century, to overcome it. Only during wartime would they get paid enough, but usually in the peacetime in between, it was a rough way to live.
So even among the military, there's this aristocracy and elitism, um, even among the military, that you get to buy your commission and you get to buy your way up the ranks. And if you're born into privilege and money, it's a lot easier for you to advance. And if you're born without money, it's near impossible. It's basically the opposite of a meritocracy, which I'm a huge believer in. Um, do you think war was inevitable when it comes to this? Do you think there was any sort of political solution that could have been reached, or was this inevitable?
Yes, there is political solutions. I don't know. It would have been a long. They were a long ways from it though when the war began. The political solutions would have been Parliament would have had to acknowledge the rights of the colonies to have some sort of representation in Parliament, or some sort of representation under the King. There was, they came up with various systems in the 19th century that some colonies like Australia and Canada flourished under the British Empire for a long time, and only kind of became independent in the 20th century. So that was possible for them to come up with a solution similar to maybe what they did with Canada or Australia. But the Parliament was still a long ways from that in 1775. Another part of this, though, is I have often thought about as I'm studying this, is that probably the war was already lost when it started. Once the war started, I think about our own experience in the 21st century in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then Vietnam before that. That these wars where you're fighting a popular revolution, no matter how many military victories you have, you can never really pull it off. You can never, you can't completely suppress what people believe.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. There's a couple of things there. One is I often do hear the argument that America would have got its independence inevitably anyway, like you saw with Canada and Australia, even if they hadn't got it during the American Revolution and the War for Independence. It would have came eventually because that colonial model was pretty much unsustainable. And two is that dichotomy between the motives of the British Empire and the colonists. The colonists were fighting on the micro level, on the soldier level. The colonists on the individual level are fighting for freedom. They're fighting for rights. They're fighting for these ideological motives. And the British are sort of fighting for money. A lot of them don't want to be there, like we mentioned. They don't like their officers. I mean, they do sort of have that ideological motive when they're fighting for country and they're for their king, but there is that dichotomy there. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I guess the I don't want to say they were totally we refer to the Americans as patriots, but the British were patriots too, and they were patriotic for what they were doing and what they were trying to achieve. And they were a professional army. Those soldiers there, whatever whatever how much they may have resented their circumstances, they knew they were soldiers in their army and they were fighting. They fought very well. They were very skilled. I think I try to bring that out in the novel. Very skilled at what they did, and that was one of the biggest, probably the first 3 years of the war. We really struggled to professionalize our own military. That was the so that dichotomy was definitely there, but ultimately. we had the more reason to be fighting than they did. And as you said, we were fighting for our country, and they were fighting us in our country. And I don't want to get too far ahead, but when they kind of gave away the shop when they hired, instead of trying to find Tories and loyal Americans that wanted to stay loyal to the king to fight for them, they went to Germany and hired Hessians to come and fight us, who essentially became mercenaries in our eyes. And I'm going to bring that up in later novels. But yeah, it was it became more of a professional army against a popular revolution.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That model of, fighting in someone else's country to sort of control them never really works out well, as we see here, we see in Vietnam, Afghanistan, all these conflicts throughout world history, never really ends well for, I guess, the invader, you could call it. But so one of the strategies of the British, because the colonists were raising militias now. Um, there's this unrest, it's escalating. They start training militias, and the British are only in Boston at this point, and a little bit elsewhere, but the main vast majority of them are centered in Boston. So they conduct these little raids to um, destroy
The powder raids
militia,
you're talking
the
about.
powder raids. Yes, destroy militia equipment. Any hopes of them sort of organizing themselves. So what exactly is their strategy to squash this rebellion?
Well, at the time that in 1775 and 1774, or at the time, I guess you'd say the First Continental Congress, when kind of I think Governor Gates realized that things were out of control, and that war was becoming inevitable. He tried to he only had I think like 7,000 soldiers in all of North America, while in Massachusetts alone was trying to raise an army of 17,000, or organize and equip an army of 17,000. And the rest of the New England colonies were contributing to that as well. So it came to about 18,000, at least, that were being committed to fight against the British. So the British soldiers were badly outnumbered, and but the war, of course, had not started yet. So what Gates was trying to do was find some way to even the odds by taking away, by raiding these arms depots, storage areas around within easy reach of New England. In fact, they had just done one in Salem, I believe it was, just a few months before. I kind of mentioned it very briefly in the near the end of the novel. But the idea again was to deprive the Americans of their arms, and then the raid on Concord was doing the same thing, was to deprive Americans of the American militias of their arms, so that they could not resist. And then the other hope was that they would get more soldiers from around the empire to come in. So they were just trying to buy time until more soldiers could come in and they could bring in peace.